The winter wind rattled the windows of William Harper's law office like bones in a wooden box. Outside, Helena, Montana lay frozen beneath a January sky the color of old iron. Inside, three people sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting for words that would change everything. James Thornton stared at his hands. 32 years of life, and he had never noticed how much they resembled his father's. The same broad knuckles, the same calluses from holding reins and splitting wood, the same capacity for building and destroying. 3 days ago, he had buried Thomas Thornton in the frozen ground north of town. The old man had lasted longer than expected. 71 years, most of them spent taking what he wanted and crushing anyone who stood in his way. A fitting end, James thought that his heart had simply stopped one morning while he was counting money in his study. William Harper cleared his throat. He was 43 silver, threading through his dark hair. Expensive suit that spoke of success in a territory where most men wore canvas and cotton. He had been the Thornton family lawyer for 15 years. He knew every secret, every transaction, every dollar earned through means that would never bear close examination. Victoria Thornton sat beside James, her back rigid as a fence post. 51 years old, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than a ranch hand earned in 6 months. She had married Thomas when she was 22, a widow with a small daughter desperate enough to overlook where the money came from. Now she was a widow again, but this time with an empire to protect. Harper opened the leather folder before him. The pages inside represented everything Thomas Thornton had built, stolen, and killed for over 4 decades. "Shall we begin?" Harper's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had learned never to show emotion when discussing fortunes built on blood. James nodded once. Harper began to read. The words washed over James like cold water. 4,500 acres, livestock, equipment, the house, investment accounts, mining interests, timber rights. A fortune that would make James one of the wealthiest men in Montana Territory. Then came the condition. To my son, James Thornton, I leave the entirety of my estate with one requirement. He must marry within 6 months of my death. Should he fail to do so, the property shall revert to territorial control to be sold at public auction. James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Victoria spoke for the first time. Thomas knew you would want to walk away from all this. He made sure you couldn't, not without destroying 40 families who depend on this ranch for their livelihoods. Harper set down the will. The territorial government is watching James. Preston Drake and his railroad consortium have been trying to acquire Thornton land for 3 years. If you forfeit through failure to marry, they'll be first in line at the auction, and they won't keep the workers on. James stood and walked to the window. Below, Helena went about its business. Wagons rolled through muddy streets. Men shouted to each other outside saloons. Women carried baskets of goods from the general store. Normal life for people who didn't carry the weight of their father's sins. He thought of Grace, 16 years old, Victoria's daughter from her first marriage. The girl had grown up in luxury, yes, but she had also grown up kind. She didn't deserve to lose everything because James couldn't bear to profit from theft and murder. He thought of the 40 families. Men who worked the land, their wives who cooked and cleaned, their children who played in the shadow of the big house. None of them had chosen to build their lives on tainted ground. They had simply taken jobs that fed their families. "I know how he built it," James said quietly, still looking out the window. "I was there. I watched him burn the Henderson barn. I was 10 years old." The memory came unbidden. Night air thick with smoke. Flames reaching toward a Montana sky thick with stars. His father's hand heavy on his shoulder. "This is how men build empires, son. They take what they need and they don't apologize for it." James had been too afraid to speak, too small to stop it, too young to understand that silence made him complicit. "The past can't be changed," Victoria said. Her voice held steel beneath the surface politeness. "But you can choose what happens next. You can abandon 40 families because your conscience hurts, or you can accept responsibility and figure out how to live with it." James turned to face her. "Is that what you do? Live with it? Every day?" No shame in her voice, no regret, just the flat acceptance of someone who had made peace with necessary evils long ago. Harper pulled a newspaper from his desk drawer, the matrimonial section pages of desperate people seeking connection across vast distances. There's a solution. It's not perfect, but it's practical. You want me to buy a wife? James couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. I want you to save 40 families, Harper replied. How you do that is your choice. James took the newspaper. Columns of advertisements, women seeking husbands, men seeking wives. Transactions disguised as romance. He thought about placing his own ad lying about who he was and what he owned, bringing some unsuspecting woman into this web of ill-gotten gains. He thought about Catherine Wells. This isn't the first time we've done this, James said. 3 years ago, Catherine Wells, my father's mail-order bride. Harper's face went carefully blank. Miss Wells left before the wedding. She realized Montana wasn't suitable for her. She disappeared. There's a difference. James, Victoria's voice carried warning. That's finished business. Is it? James met her eyes. Because I found something in Father's papers. A telegram. It said Catherine Wells, federal agent, handled, and it was signed with your initials, William. The silence that followed could have frozen blood. Harper recovered first years of legal training, smoothing his features into neutral concern. James, I don't know what you think you found, but I can assure you. Don't. James's voice cut through the excuse. I've spent 3 years pretending I didn't know. Pretending she just ran away. But I'm done pretending. Victoria stood. Then what do you want, James? To go to the authorities to destroy this family over speculation about a woman who's been gone for 3 years? Do you think that will bring her back? It might bring justice. Justice? Victoria laughed, the sound bitter as January wind. You want to lecture me about justice? You who've lived on your father's money for 32 years, who signed land transfer documents without asking where the land came from, who hired men to work this ranch without wondering why their wages came so easy. Every word landed like a blow because every word was true. I was young, James said, but it sounded weak even to his own ears. You were old enough to know, Victoria replied. You just chose not to ask questions because the answers would have required you to do something. And now you want to play the righteous man. Fine. Walk away. Forfeit everything. 40 families can starve while you feel good about your moral superiority. James wanted to hate her, wanted to rage against her cold calculation. But she was right. He had been complicit. Every meal he'd eaten, every piece of clothing he'd worn every day, he'd lived in comfort, had been paid for with stolen land and broken families. Grace appeared in the doorway. She must have been waiting outside listening. Her face was pale, eyes red from crying over the grandfather who had in his way loved her. Brother, she said softly. James wasn't her blood brother, but she'd called him that since she was 6 years old. What are you going to do? Looking at her. James felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. She was 16, too young to be thrown into the world without protection, too innocent to pay for her mother's choices or her stepfather's sins. I'll place the advertisement, he said quietly. Harper nodded, already pulling paper from his desk. I'll help you write it. We'll be deliberately vague about the estate. Just say you're a farmer seeking a wife. Another lie, James said. A necessary one, Harper replied. We tell the truth after she arrives. Give her the choice to leave if she wants, but at least we'll have met the legal requirement for attempting to marry. Victoria relaxed fractionally. Good. This is the practical choice, James. The right choice. James wasn't sure there was a right choice anymore. Just different degrees of wrong, and he was choosing the one that hurt fewer people. As he sat to compose the advertisement, his mind drifted back 3 years. To a spring morning when Catherine Wells had arrived in Helena, to the moment when everything had started to unravel. The memory took him whether he wanted it to or not. Spring 1881. James had been 29, his father still alive and vigorous, ruling the Thornton Empire with an iron hand wrapped in expensive gloves. Catherine Wells stepped off the train like she owned the platform. 26 years old from Philadelphia, answering Thomas Thornton's advertisement for a bride. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty was common enough. What made Catherine different was the intelligence in her eyes, the way she looked at everything, cataloging details, missing nothing. James had gone to the station with his father. Thomas was 60, then silver-haired and broad-shouldered, still strong enough to break a man if needed. He smiled when he saw Catherine, the predatory smile of a man who had paid for something and expected to receive it. "Miss Wells," Thomas had said, "welcome to Montana." "Mr. Thornton." Catherine's voice held the educated tones of the East Coast. "Thank you for your hospitality." James had stood to the side watching. Something about Catherine didn't fit. Most mail-order brides arrived desperate, grateful for any escape from poverty. Catherine arrived like someone with choices, like someone who had selected Montana for reasons that had nothing to do with desperation. On the ride back to the estate, James had ridden alongside the wagon. Catherine sat up front with Thomas, asking questions about the land, the history, how the ranch had grown. Thomas answered with practiced smoothness, stories of hard work and vision, careful omissions of intimidation and violence, the version of history he told himself so he could sleep at night. Catherine listened, asked more questions. Her interest seemed genuine, but James noticed how specific her questions were. What families had owned the land before? When had it been acquired? Were there any disputes over ownership? That night, after Catherine had been shown to her room, James found his father in the study. "She's not what she seems," James said. Thomas poured whiskey into 2 glasses. "No woman is son. They all want something. Catherine wants security. I want a young wife. It's a fair trade." "She asks too many questions about the land." "Curiosity isn't a crime." Thomas handed James a glass. "Though I admit she's sharper than I expected. I'll have William look into her background more thoroughly. Make sure there are no surprises." But there were surprises. Catherine wasn't just curious. She was investigating. Over the next 2 weeks, James watched her move through the house and grounds like a woman on a mission. She befriended the ranch hands, asking about their lives. She rode into town and spoke with old-timers who remembered the early days. She visited the county office and examined land records. James tried to warn her. It was evening. They walked the grounds together, the mountains purple in the distance. Catherine asked him about his childhood, his relationship with his father, his plans for the future. "You ask a lot of questions," James said. "I'm a curious person." "Curiosity can be dangerous here." Catherine stopped walking. "Is that a threat, Mr. Thornton?" "It's a warning. My father built this ranch through methods that wouldn't stand up to close examination. If you're looking for proof of that, you'll find it. And when you do, people who have worked very hard to bury the past won't appreciate you digging it up." "Are you one of those people?" James had to think about that. Was he? He benefited from his father's crimes. He lived in the house built with blood money, but he hadn't pulled the triggers or set the fires. "I'm someone who knows how dangerous the truth can be," he finally said. Catherine studied him. "And yet you're warning me anyway. Why?" "Because I don't want to see you get hurt." "How thoughtful." Her voice held an edge. "Tell me, Mr. Thornton, do you warn all your father's victims before they're destroyed, or am I special?" The week before the wedding, everything came apart. James was in the barn when Catherine found him. Her face was flushed, eyes bright with excitement and fear. "I found them," she said without preamble. "Found what?" "Documents. Contracts your father signed with men he hired to intimidate homesteaders. Letters ordering violence. Receipts for payments made after specific incidents. James, your father, didn't just take land. He had people killed for it." James felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had known his father was ruthless, but murder. Documented murder. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden in the old homestead property. The Henderson place. Your father kept evidence of his crimes like trophies." "Catherine, you need to stop this. Now. If my father finds out what you know—" "He already knows." Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your stepmother found me searching. She knows what I am." What you are. James's throat went tight. What does that mean? Catherine reached into her jacket and pulled out a small badge. Federal, Department of Justice. I'm not a mail-order bride, James. I'm an investigator. I was sent here to gather evidence of land fraud in Montana Territory. Your father's ranch was my assignment. James couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. I'm sorry, Catherine continued. I know you're not like him. I've watched you with the workers, the way you treat people. You're better than this place, but I have a job to do. They'll kill you. The words came out flat, certain. Victoria won't let you destroy this family. She has too much to lose. I'm not afraid. You should be. That was the last real conversation James had with Catherine Wells. That night he lay awake in his room trying to decide what to do. Warn his father. Help Catherine escape, pretend he knew nothing, and let events unfold as they would. By morning, the choice had been made for him. Catherine was gone. Her room was empty, her bags missing. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. Just absence where a person had been. Victoria claimed Catherine had packed in the night and left. The sheriff searched, but found nothing. 6 months of investigation turned up no trace. Catherine Wells had simply vanished from the earth. And James had said nothing about the badge, the investigation, the danger he'd known she was in. He told himself there was no proof, that speaking up would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. He told himself many lies in those months after Catherine disappeared. He told them so often that sometimes he almost believed them. Then 3 months after Catherine vanished, his father died. Heart attack in his study. Quick, relatively painless. Better than the old bastard deserved. While sorting through Thomas's papers, James found the telegram. Brief, brutal damning. Catherine Wells, federal agent, handled. Signed W.H. William Harper. James had burned the telegram immediately. Destroyed the evidence of his family's latest murder. Then he'd gone to his room and gotten drunk for 3 days straight. When he sobered up, he made a decision. He would keep the secret. He would tell himself Catherine had simply left, that she was alive somewhere, that he was protecting people by staying silent. It was the coward's choice, and he knew it. But knowing didn't give him the courage to do differently. Now, 3 years later, sitting in William Harper's office composing an advertisement for another mail-order bride, James felt the weight of that cowardice pressing down on him like stone. How about this? Harper read from the paper he'd been writing. Honest Montana farmer seeks hard-working wife. Life will be simple but respectable. Must be willing to work hard. Write to James Thornton, Helena, Montana. Honest. The word stuck in James's throat. It's perfect, Victoria said. James signed his name at the bottom, sealing another lie. The advertisement ran in papers across the East Coast. For 2 weeks, James received no responses. He began to hope the whole thing would simply fail, that the ranch would revert to the territory, that the decision would be taken out of his hands. Then a letter arrived from Boston. The handwriting was clear, the words carefully chosen. Sarah Wade, 24 years old, no family, working as a housemaid, seeking honest work and a respectable life. Something in her letter touched James. The dignity in her words despite the desperation behind them. The way she didn't pretend to be anything other than what she was, poor alone hoping for something better. He wrote back that same day, short, direct, come to Montana. We'll be married within the week. Sarah Wade boarded a train with $11 to her name and no idea she was traveling toward the same fate that had claimed Catherine Wells. The train journey took 6 days. Sarah watched the landscape transform outside her window. Cities gave way to farmland, farmland to prairie, prairie to mountains. With each passing mile, she moved further from everything familiar. She thought about her father often during that journey. Henry Wade had been a good man, honest and hard-working. He'd told her once about Montana, about the land they'd lost there when she was too young to remember. We had a homestead, he'd said, eyes distant with memory. 160 acres, good land near water. Your mother and I built a life there. What happened? Sarah had asked. Big ranchers wanted to expand. They made us an offer we couldn't accept. Then they made sure we couldn't refuse. Barn fire, Poisoned livestock. Your brother, he was 12, they took him for 3 days, brought him back with a broken leg. Who did it? Her father had shaken his head. Rich men, powerful men, the kind who take what they want and don't answer for it. They'd sold the land for a fraction of its worth and fled to Boston. 20 years of poverty followed. Sarah's mother had died of tuberculosis that could have been treated if they'd had money. Her brother David had gone to sea trying to earn enough to help the family and drowned when his ship went down in a storm. Her father had died 2 years ago, his heart simply giving out. Sarah had always thought it was from grief more than age. Now she was going back to Montana, not knowing that the advertisement she'd answered had been placed by the son of the man who'd destroyed her family. The train pulled into Helena on a cold afternoon at the end of March. Sarah stepped onto the platform, her single carpet bag in hand, and felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. People were staring, not with curiosity, but with something else. Pity, fear. She couldn't tell. A woman in a green dress gasped and turned to her companion. "Another one," Sarah heard her say. A man standing outside the general store shook his head slowly like he was watching someone walk to their execution. James Thornton stood near the wagon. Sarah recognized him from his brief description. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes that looked simple but were made of quality fabric. His face was weathered by sun and wind lines around his eyes that spoke of long days outdoors. He approached slowly like a man walking toward something he dreaded. "Miss Wade." His voice was deep, careful. "You came." Something in the way he said it made Sarah's skin prickle, like he'd expected her not to, like he'd hoped she wouldn't. "Of course," Sarah replied. "I said I would." James nodded, took her bag. His hands were large, calloused, but he handled her worn carpet bag like it was precious. On the way to the wagon, Sarah saw the poster. It was tacked to the wall of the sheriff's office. A woman's face printed from a photograph, young, pretty, with intelligent eyes. Missing, Catherine Wells. Last seen April 1881. If you have information, contact Helena Sheriff's Department. Sarah stopped walking. "Mr. Thornton, who is this woman?" James's hand tightened on her bag. "No one you need to worry about." "The poster says she's missing." "She left 3 years ago. People still hope she'll come back." "People don't go missing when they leave." Sarah kept her voice level. "What happened to her?" James looked at her, then really looked at her. Sarah saw something in his eyes. Guilt, fear, and beneath both a desperate kind of honesty trying to break through. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I wish I did." They drove out of town in silence. Sarah watched the buildings thin and disappear, replaced by open grassland that stretched to distant mountains. The isolation hit her then. 8 miles from town. 8 miles from help if she needed it. When the wagon crested a rise, Sarah saw the Thornton estate spread below them like something from a dream or a nightmare. The house was massive. 3 stories of elegant construction-wide porches, tall windows catching the afternoon sun. Outbuildings clustered around it. A barn that could hold 50 horses. A bunkhouse for workers. Equipment sheds. And beyond fields stretching to the horizon. This wasn't a farm. This was an empire. Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You said simple." James stared straight ahead. "I said life would be simple. Not that I was poor." "You lied." "I omitted." "That's the same thing." "I know." James finally looked at her. "I'm sorry. But if I'd told the truth, you wouldn't have come. And I need someone who came for the right reasons." "The right reasons?" Sarah felt anger building. "I came because I was desperate, because I had nowhere else to go. Those are your right reasons." "Yes, because that means you chose this life, not the money. That means I can trust you." Sarah wanted to rage at him, wanted to demand he take her back to town immediately. But she had $6 left. Not enough for a train ticket back to Boston. Not enough for a room while she looked for work. She was trapped, at least for now. "One night," she said coldly. "I'll stay 1 night. Then you'll explain everything. No more lies." "Deal," James said. then added, "But Sarah, when we get to the house, don't trust anyone completely, not even me." The warning should have terrified her. Instead, it made her angry. She'd come all this way, spent her last dollars on hope, and walked straight into another web of rich people's secrets. The wagon rolled through the gates of the estate as the sun touched the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the manicured grounds. The house looked beautiful in the fading light, peaceful, safe. Sarah didn't believe any of it. Victoria Thornton waited on the porch, 51 years old, dressed in gray silk diamonds at her throat. She watched Sarah climb down from the wagon with the cold assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "So you've brought us another bride," Victoria said. The phrasing made Sarah's stomach turn. Another, like she was a replacement part. "Aunt Victoria," James said. "This is Miss Sarah Wade. Sarah, my stepmother, Victoria Thornton." Victoria descended the steps with practiced grace. "Miss Wade, welcome to Thornton Estate. I trust your journey was pleasant?" "It was long," Sarah replied, matching Victoria's formal tone exactly. "I'm sure you're exhausted. I'll have Martha show you to your room. Dinner is at 7. We dress for dinner, but I'm sure we can find something suitable for you." The dismissal was clear. Sarah was being sent away like a servant, but she stood her ground. "Before I go anywhere, I'd like to know what happened to Catherine Wells." The silence that crashed over the porch was absolute. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. James closed his eyes briefly as if in pain. A young woman appeared in the doorway, 16, auburn hair, pretty, but marked by an exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. This had to be Grace Victoria's daughter. "Miss Wade," Victoria said carefully, "I understand you're confused, but that's family business that doesn't concern you." "It concerns me if I'm about to become family." Victoria's smile was cold as winter stone. Catherine left. She realized Montana wasn't suitable for her and departed. These things happen with mail-order marriages. Without a word to anyone. Without taking the train. There are other ways to travel. Before Sarah could press further, Grace spoke from the doorway. "You should leave Miss Wade. Tonight if you can. Don't stay here." "Grace." Victoria's voice cracked like a whip, but Grace kept her eyes on Sarah. "She didn't leave. They're lying. Please, before it's too late." Then she turned and fled back into the house, her footsteps echoing on polished wood. Victoria smoothed her skirts, composure returning. "My daughter is emotional. She was fond of Catherine and took the departure hard. Pay her no mind." But Sarah had seen the fear in Grace's eyes. Real, genuine terror. James stepped between them. "Sarah, please. Let me explain privately. There's a lot you don't understand." Sarah looked at the house, at Victoria's cold face, at the shadows gathering in the corners. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But where would she go? She had no money, no allies, no way back to Boston. She thought of her father, driven from his land by rich men who took what they wanted. She thought of Catherine Wells, vanished without a trace. She thought of Grace's warning, and she made a decision. She wouldn't run, not yet, not until she understood what had happened here. "Show me to my room," she said. A middle-aged woman in a housekeeper's dress appeared. "Martha." She led Sarah up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a long hallway lined with closed doors. At the end, she opened a room and gestured Sarah inside. "This was Miss Catherine's room," Martha said quietly. Of course it was. Of course they'd put her in the dead woman's room. The space was beautiful. 4-poster bed with fine linens. A wardrobe that could hold 10 times the clothes Sarah owned. A vanity with a real silver mirror. French doors opened onto a small balcony overlooking the grounds. Sarah set her carpet bag on the bed. What really happened to her? Martha's eyes widened with fear. "I couldn't say, miss." "Couldn't or won't?" "Couldn't, because I don't know. One night she was here. The next, she was gone. Her things were packed, but she didn't take the wagon or the horses. She just disappeared. And no one found that suspicious." Martha wrung her hands. "Of course we did. But what could we say? The sheriff searched, found nothing. After a while, people stopped looking." "Do you think someone hurt her?" Martha went pale. "I think you should have your dinner and not ask questions that could get you hurt too, miss." She left before Sarah could respond. Alone in Catherine's room, Sarah stood in the center of the floor and tried to understand what she'd walked into. A rich man who'd lied about his wealth. A missing woman who'd vanished without trace. A family that radiated secrets like heat from a stove. She walked to the French doors and stepped onto the balcony. The grounds stretched below, beautiful in the twilight. Somewhere out there, Catherine Wells had disappeared, and Sarah was sleeping in her room wearing clothes meant for her walking in her footsteps. As she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye. A gap between two floorboards on the balcony. Something white wedged there, barely visible. Sarah knelt and worked it free with her fingers. Paper old and weathered, but still legible. 4 words written in a shaking hand. "They're watching. Trust no one." Below that, more words. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. Evidence hidden at Henderson Farm. Old well. Tell federal agents everything." It was signed with a single initial. K. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the note. Catherine had known she was in danger. Catherine had hidden this message hoping someone would find it. Sarah looked up at the house, at windows glowing with warm light. Somewhere inside, the people who had killed Catherine were sitting down to dinner, and Sarah had just agreed to stay the night. She slipped the note into her pocket and returned to the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She needed to tell someone. But who? James had warned her not to trust anyone, including him. Victoria had all but threatened her. Grace was terrified but powerless. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Wade," Martha's voice. "Dinner in 30 minutes." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, the same mirror Catherine had looked into, wearing clothes meant for Catherine. Standing in Catherine's room. She thought about running. Climbing down from the balcony, walking the 8 miles back to town, throwing herself on the mercy of strangers. But that's what Catherine had tried to do, and Catherine was dead. No, Sarah wouldn't run. She would find out the truth. She would make sure Catherine's death meant something. She changed into the dress Victoria had left for her. Green silk, far finer than anything she'd ever worn. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her measurements. Or for someone with her measurements. Sarah pinned up her dark hair and studied her reflection. She looked like someone else, someone who belonged in this house of secrets and lies. She touched the note in her pocket one more time, then went downstairs to dinner. The dining room was another display of wealth. A table that could seat 20 set for 5. Crystal glasses catching light from an enormous chandelier. Paintings on the walls, stern-faced men and severe women, generations of Thorntons staring down with cold eyes. Victoria sat at the head, Grace to her left, James by the fireplace, and a 4th person Sarah hadn't met yet. The man stood when Sarah entered. Mid-40s, silver threading through dark hair, expensive suit. "Miss Wade," his voice was cultured Eastern. "I'm William Harper. I manage the Thornton business interests and serve as family counsel." Sarah shook his hand. It was soft, the hand of a man who worked with papers, not tools. "Mr. Harper, please sit." He pulled out a chair for her. Too polite, too smooth. Dinner was served by 3 people Sarah hadn't seen before. The food was excellent. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that must have cost a fortune in winter. Sarah barely tasted any of it. The conversation was stilted. Victoria asked about Boston. Sarah gave brief, vague answers. Harper made observations about the weather. Grace said nothing, just pushed food around her plate. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I'd like to know what happened to Catherine Wells." Forks clattered against plates. Harper set down his wine glass carefully. James stared at the table. Victoria's voice was ice. "I've already explained that Miss Wells left of her own accord." "Then why is there a missing person poster in town?" "Her family filed it. They refused to accept that she simply changed her mind about marrying into this family." "Did she change her mind? Or was it changed for her?" Harper leaned forward. "Miss Wade, you've been here less than a day. Perhaps you should focus on settling in rather than resurrecting old business." Old business that involves a dead woman. Who said anything about dead? Harper's voice went sharp. Catherine Wells left, that's all. If you continue to make wild accusations, you'll find yourself on the next train back to Boston. Sarah met his eyes. Is that a threat, Mr. Harper? It's practical advice. James stood abruptly. Sarah, a word, now. He led her from the dining room down a hallway into a study lined with bookshelves. He closed the door and turned to face her. What are you doing? His voice was low, urgent. You can't just accuse my family of murder at dinner. Can't I? You brought me here under false pretenses. You put me in a dead woman's room. I found her note. Sarah pulled the paper from her pocket. She knew she was going to die, and she knew who was going to kill her. James took the note, read it, and closed his eyes. Where did you find this? Hidden on the balcony. The balcony Catherine fell from. We don't know that she fell. But you suspect it. Sarah moved closer. You know something. Tell me. James was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk and unlocked a drawer. From it, he pulled a single piece of paper. A telegram. Old, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. He handed it to Sarah. She read it once, twice. The words didn't change. Catherine Wells, federal agent, handled, R.M. W.H. William Harper, the family lawyer. Sarah looked up at James. You knew. I suspected. I found this 3 years ago after my father died. I've carried it with me every day since. And you did nothing. What could I do? James's voice was raw. Tell the sheriff that my family's lawyer might have killed a federal agent based on a telegram that could mean anything. I had no proof, no body, no witnesses, just suspicion and guilt. So you stayed silent. I stayed silent. He met her eyes. I'm a coward, Sarah. I've known for 3 years that someone in my family probably killed Catherine Wells, and I did nothing, because it was easier to pretend, easier to lie to myself. Sarah studied him. She saw the truth in his face, the shame, the self-loathing, but also something else, a desperate need for someone to help him do the right thing. The note says evidence is hidden at the Henderson farm, old well. We need to find it. If we start digging into this, people will get hurt. My family will fight to protect themselves. People are already hurt. Catherine is dead. How many others did your father kill to build this empire? James flinched like she'd struck him. I don't know. Too many. Then help me find out. Help me get justice for them. And if that means destroying 40 families who depend on this ranch. Sarah thought about her father, about all the families destroyed by men like Thomas Thornton, about the cycle of violence and theft that had to stop somewhere. Then they'll have to find new work. Better to lose your job than your soul. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Tomorrow. We'll go to the Henderson property and see what Catherine hid there. A noise in the hallway made them both turn, footsteps moving quickly away. Someone had been listening. James moved to the door, opened it. The hallway was empty, but a door at the far end was just closing. Grace's room. She heard everything, Sarah said. Grace won't tell. She's been afraid of her mother since Catherine disappeared. She wants the truth as much as we do. They returned to the dining room to find Victoria and Harper gone. Only Grace remained sitting alone at the long table. She looked up when they entered. You're both going to get killed. We can't keep living with lies, James said gently. Then leave, both of you, tonight. Walk away from this place and never look back. I can't, James said. This is my responsibility. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Catherine said the same thing, that she had a responsibility, that justice mattered more than safety. The next morning she was gone. What did you hear that night? Sarah sat beside Grace. The night Catherine disappeared. Grace wiped her eyes. I heard shouting. Mother and Catherine on the balcony. Mother said, "You'll destroy this family." Catherine said, "Someone has to pay for what was done." Then screaming, a sound like something heavy falling. Then silence. Did you tell anyone? I was 13. I was terrified. By morning, Catherine's room was empty, and Mother said she'd left in the night. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than believing my mother was a murderer. Sarah reached for Grace's hand. You were a child. This isn't your fault. I could have spoken up, could have told the sheriff what I heard, but I was scared and I wanted things to go back to normal, so I stayed quiet. Just like James stayed quiet. Just like everyone in this territory stays quiet when powerful people do terrible things. She stood pulling her hand away. But you won't stay quiet, will you, Miss Wade? You're going to dig and ask questions and push until someone pushes back, just like Catherine. Yes, Sarah said simply. Then God help you. Grace fled the room. James and Sarah were left alone in the big empty dining room. Outside, night had fallen completely. The house creaked and settled around them. You could still leave, James said. I'd give you money for the train. Make sure you got safely back to Boston. And let Catherine's death mean nothing. Let your father's victims go unavenged. Sarah shook her head. No, I'm staying, not to marry you, but to finish what Catherine started. Even if it gets you killed. Even then. James looked at her with something like wonder. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish. Maybe both. Sarah managed a tired smile. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to sleep. We have a well to excavate tomorrow. She returned to Catherine's room, locked the door, and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Then she lay on the bed, still in the green silk dress, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this house, a murderer was sleeping peacefully. Victoria, who had pushed Catherine from the balcony. Richard Morgan, who had arranged the cover-up. Maybe others. A whole conspiracy of silence built to protect an empire of blood. Sarah thought about her father one more time. About how he'd worked his whole life honestly and died with nothing. About how the people who destroyed him had lived in luxury and never answered for their crimes. Not this time. This time, there would be justice. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep in a dead woman's bed in a room that held secrets 3 years old in a house built on bones. Tomorrow she would start digging, and she wouldn't stop until she found the truth, no matter who it destroyed. Outside her window, Montana stars blazed cold and distant. The same stars that had shone the night Catherine Wells died. The same stars that would shine when Sarah Wade either brought justice or joined Catherine in the grave. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. It sounded like a warning. Dawn broke cold over the Thornton estate. Sarah woke to pale light filtering through the curtains of Catherine's room, her body stiff from sleeping in the green silk dress. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory returned like cold water. She was in Montana, in a dead woman's room, about to dig up secrets that might get her killed. Sarah rose and changed into her own clothes, the simple cotton dress she'd worn on the train. The silk felt like a costume, now something meant to disguise her as someone she wasn't. She needed to be herself today. Plain, honest Sarah Wade, daughter of a farmer who'd been destroyed by men like Thomas Thornton. She found the note Catherine had left and read it again. Henderson Farm, Old Well, evidence hidden where the first crime was committed. A knock at the door made her fold the note quickly and tuck it into her pocket. Miss Wade, James's voice quiet and careful. Are you awake? Sarah opened the door. James looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were shadowed, his face drawn. He carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cold morning air. I thought you might need this, he said, offering her a cup. Sarah took it, grateful for the warmth. Did you tell anyone about our plans? No, but we need to move carefully. If Victoria suspects we're investigating Catherine's death, she'll take steps to stop us. What kind of steps? James's silence was answer enough. They were standing in the hallway discussing murder when the front door opened downstairs. Heavy footsteps on the wooden floor, men's voices authoritative and commanding. James went pale. That's the sheriff. Why would he be here this early? They moved to the top of the stairs. Below in the entrance hall stood 4 men. One wore a sheriff's star on his vest. The others were clearly federal marshals, their badges catching the morning light. and in front of them stood a man Sarah had never seen before. Late 30s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the field. He carried himself with quiet authority, and when he looked up and saw James on the stairs, his expression was unreadable. "Mr. Thornton," the man said, "I'm Special Agent Daniel Cole, United States Department of Justice. I need to speak with you about the disappearance of Catherine Wells." The words fell into the house like stones into still water. Sarah felt the ripples spread, felt the careful facade of normalcy begin to crack. Victoria appeared from the dining room dressed despite the early hour. Her face was composed, but Sarah saw the tension in her shoulders. "Agent Cole, this is highly irregular. You can't simply burst into a private home and make demands." Cole turned to her. "I have a warrant, Mrs. Thornton, signed by a federal judge. It gives me authority to search this property and question all residents regarding the disappearance and suspected murder of Catherine Wells." Murder. The word hung in the air like smoke. William Harper emerged from the study already dressed in his lawyer's suit as if he'd been expecting this. "Agent Cole, any warrant you have is subject to territorial jurisdiction. I'll need to verify its legitimacy before you proceed." Cole pulled a folded document from his jacket and handed it to Harper. "Feel free to verify. While you're doing that, I'll begin my interviews." Harper's eyes scanned the warrant and Sarah saw his expression tighten. Whatever he'd hoped to find this document was airtight. James descended the stairs slowly, Sarah following. Grace appeared in the hallway above, drawn by the commotion. Cole's gaze swept the room, cataloging everyone present. When his eyes landed on Sarah, they lingered for a moment. "And you are—" "Sarah Wade. I arrived yesterday." Something flickered in Cole's expression. Recognition, surprise. "Wade, from Boston." "Yes." "And you're here to marry Mr. Thornton?" "I was considering it. Now I'm not so sure." A ghost of a smile touched Cole's lips. "Smart woman." Victoria stepped forward. "Agent Cole, whatever you think happened here, I assure you it's a misunderstanding. Catherine Wells was a guest in this house. When she decided to leave, we searched for her extensively. The local sheriff can confirm that." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. He was a local man in his 50s, with the look of someone who'd spent too many years keeping peace in a territory where power mattered more than law. "That's true," Morrison said. "We searched for weeks, found nothing." "You searched with the resources available to a territorial sheriff," Cole replied. "I'm searching with the resources of the federal government. There's a difference." He turned to James. "Mr. Thornton, I understand you were the last person to speak with Catherine Wells before she disappeared. Is that correct?" James stood at the base of the stairs, trapped between the truth and his family's lies. Sarah could see the struggle in his face. Speak up and betray everyone he'd ever known. Stay silent and become complicit in murder. Before James could answer, Sarah pulled Catherine's note from her pocket. "Agent Cole," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I found this hidden in Catherine's room." She crossed the hall and handed him the note. Cole read it, his expression hardening with each word. "Where exactly did you find this, Miss Wade?" Wedged between floorboards on the balcony outside the room where Catherine slept. Cole looked up at Victoria. "Mrs. Thornton, this note suggests Catherine Wells believed she was in danger. It also references evidence hidden at a location called Henderson Farm. Can you explain that?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "That note is obviously a forgery. This woman just arrived yesterday. She could have written it herself." "We'll verify the handwriting," Cole said, "and I'll be issuing an order to excavate the well on the old Henderson property." Harper stepped forward. "Agent Cole, you can't simply dig up private property based on a note of questionable origin." Cole pulled another document from his jacket. "This is a second warrant authorizing excavation of the Henderson farm site. The property is technically abandoned, so no permission is required. Sheriff Morrison, I'll need your men to assist." Morrison nodded reluctantly. He worked for the Thorntons in all but name, but he couldn't refuse a federal warrant. Victoria's face had gone white. Harper moved to her side, his hand on her elbow in a gesture that looked supportive but might have been restraining. Cole gestured to his marshals. "Search the house. I want every room examined, every document cataloged. If Catherine Wells was murdered, the evidence is somewhere in this building." As the marshals moved through the house, Cole turned his attention back to James and Sarah. "I'd like to speak with both of you, separately. Mr. Thornton, you first. Miss Wade, please wait in the sitting room." James followed Cole into the study. The door closed, leaving Sarah alone with Victoria Harper and the sound of federal marshals searching through 3 generations of Thornton's secrets. Victoria's eyes locked on Sarah. "You have no idea what you've done." "I've started telling the truth. Someone should have done it 3 years ago." "The truth?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "You've been here one day and you think you understand what happened. You know nothing about this family, about what we've built, about what we've sacrificed. I know Catherine Wells is dead. I know someone in this house killed her." Harper's hand tightened on Victoria's arm. "Mrs. Thornton, don't say another word. Not without counsel present." But Victoria pulled away from him. "Why not? This girl has already condemned us. We're going to lose everything anyway." She moved closer to Sarah, and for the first time Sarah saw past the cold exterior to something else. Desperation, fear, and beneath it all a kind of terrible grief. "Catherine was investigating my husband," Victoria said quietly. "She was a federal agent. Did you know that? She came here under false pretenses, lying about who she was, why she was here. She infiltrated our home, pretended to care about Thomas, all while gathering evidence to destroy us." "Because your husband was a criminal," Sarah replied, "because he stole land and killed people. He built an empire. He gave jobs to hundreds of people. He turned wilderness into civilization. He destroyed families, including mine." Victoria stopped. "What?" Sarah pulled out the second piece of paper she carried. The land transfer document she'd found in her father's papers before he died. The one he'd kept as evidence of injustice even though he knew he'd never get justice. "Henry Wade," Sarah said. "My father. He owned 160 acres north of here. Your husband wanted that land, so he terrorized my family until my father sold it for a fraction of its worth. My family fled to Boston and lived in poverty for 20 years. My mother died of tuberculosis because we couldn't afford medicine. My brother drowned trying to earn money at sea. My father died of a broken heart." She met Victoria's eyes. "Your husband didn't just steal land. He killed my family as surely as if he'd shot them. So don't talk to me about what you've built. It's all blood and bones." Victoria stared at her. For a moment, something like understanding passed between them. 2 women shaped by the violence of powerful men. One who'd profited from it, one who'd been destroyed by it. Then the moment passed. Victoria's face hardened again. "If your family had been stronger, they would have kept their land. That's how the world works." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but that doesn't make it right." The study door opened. James emerged, his face ashen. Cole gestured to Sarah. "Miss Wade, your turn." Sarah entered the study. Cole closed the door and gestured to a chair. "Please sit." She sat, and Cole took the chair opposite. He pulled out a notebook and pen, professional and methodical. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the moment you answered James Thornton's advertisement to finding that note," Sarah told him. "The advertisement that promised a simple life. The train journey west, arriving to find not a poor farmer but a wealthy estate. The warnings from Grace, the poster of Catherine, the note hidden on the balcony." Cole listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Miss Wade, I need you to understand something. Catherine Wells wasn't just a federal agent. She was one of our best investigators. Smart, thorough, dedicated. When she went silent 3 years ago, we knew something terrible had happened. But without evidence, without a body, we couldn't move forward." "You think she's dead?" "I know she's dead." Cole's voice was flat, certain. "No agent goes dark that long without cause. And now you've found her note, her warning. That's the break we've needed." "What was she investigating?" "Land fraud throughout Montana Territory. Your father's case was one of dozens. Thomas Thornton and men like him built empires by driving homesteaders off their claims through violence and intimidation. Some of it was legal at the time, much of it wasn't, but with the right judges and sheriffs in their pockets, they got away with it. And Catherine was going to expose them. She was gathering evidence for federal prosecution. If she'd succeeded, half the territorial government would have faced charges. Cole leaned forward. 2 days before she disappeared, Catherine sent us a telegram. Cole's expression darkened. The telegraph operator who sent that message, Daniel Hayes, was found dead 2 days later, shot in an alley, made to look like a robbery, but his family said he'd seemed frightened, said someone had been asking questions about federal telegrams. She said she'd found documentation, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. She was going to retrieve it that night. From the Henderson farm. That's what your note suggests, and that's why we're excavating that well today. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. You think she's in the well? I think someone wanted to make sure she never told anyone what she'd found, and I think they're in this house right now. There was a commotion in the hallway, raised voices. Sarah and Cole emerged to find one of the marshals descending the stairs carrying a wooden box. "Agent Cole," the marshal called. "Found this hidden behind a false panel in the master bedroom, locked." Cole took the box. It was old oak, heavy with a substantial lock. "Mrs. Thornton, do you have the key to this?" Victoria had gone very pale. "I've never seen that box before." "It was in your bedroom, hidden in a compartment behind the bookshelf. That was my husband's private space. I never touched it." Cole produced a set of lockpicks. Within minutes he had the box open. Inside were papers, dozens of them yellowed with age. Cole pulled out the top document and began to read. His expression went from interested to shocked to disgusted in the space of seconds. "What is it?" Harper demanded. Cole spread several papers across the hall table. Contracts, signed by Thomas Thornton agreeing to pay men for what he calls enforcement work. Letters detailing exactly what methods should be used to force people off their land. And receipts. He held up one paper, his voice hard. A receipt for $2,000 paid to a man named Sykes for permanent removal of a witness. Cole pulled out another document. "And here's something interesting. A letter from Preston Drake to Thomas Thornton dated March 1881. Regarding our mutual interest in keeping territorial investigations quiet, I'm prepared to assist with any complications that might arise." This was written 2 weeks before Catherine disappeared. "That's murder for hire in writing," Victoria swayed. Harper caught her before she fell. James moved to the table and picked up one of the letters. His hand shook as he read his father's handwriting. Orders to burn buildings, instructions for beating farmers who refused to sell, payments for crimes that had destroyed families. "This is all him," James said, his voice barely audible. "My father, all of it documented." But Cole was still going through the box. He pulled out more papers, and his expression changed again. "Mr. Thornton," he said carefully, "there are documents here dated after your father's death, dated from the last 5 years, and they're signed by you." James looked up sharply. "What?" Cole laid out 3 land transfer documents. All bore James Thornton's signature. All involved properties that had questionable ownership histories. "These families," Cole said, "the Mitchells, the Coopers, the Grants, they all claim they were forced off their land through intimidation, and you signed the transfer documents." James stared at the papers like they were vipers. "Richard brought these to me. He said they were routine transfers, families that wanted to sell. I trusted him. I didn't ask questions. Didn't ask or didn't want to know." The question hung in the air. Sarah saw the truth in James's face. He had known on some level, known the transfers weren't clean, known people were being hurt, but asking questions would have required him to act, and acting would have cost him everything. Cole gathered the documents carefully. "Mr. Thornton, these papers suggest you were complicit in land fraud. That's a federal crime." Before James could respond, one of the marshals came running in from outside. "Agent Cole, we found something at the Henderson property." The words galvanized everyone. Cole grabbed his coat. "Sheriff Morrison, bring your wagon. Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Harper, you're coming with us. I want everyone present for this." they assembled a grim caravan. Cole and his marshals in one wagon, Morrison and his deputies in another, the Thorntons and Sarah in a third. The ride to the Henderson farm took 40 minutes, following old trails through grassland that was just beginning to green with spring. The Henderson property was a ruin. The house had collapsed years ago, timbers rotting into the ground. The barn was a blackened skeleton, never rebuilt after Thomas Thornton had ordered it burned. Fences had fallen, the land had gone wild, and in the center of it all stood the well. Old stone construction partially collapsed, covered with rotting boards. A crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in Montana, and the sight of federal marshals digging for a body had drawn spectators from town. Sarah saw shopkeepers, ranch hands, housewives, even the newspaper editor with his notebook ready. This wasn't going to be a quiet excavation. Whatever they found would be public knowledge within hours. Cole approached the well with his marshals. Ropes and pulleys had been set up. The rotting boards had been pulled away, revealing darkness below. "How deep?" Cole asked. One of the marshals dropped a stone. It fell for a long moment before hitting bottom with a distant splash. 30 feet, maybe more, partially filled with water and debris. "I'm going down," Cole said. "Sir, it's not safe. The walls could collapse." "Then make sure you pull me up fast if they start to." Cole secured a rope around his waist and began the descent into darkness. The crowd pressed closer, silent now. Sarah stood with James, both of them unable to look away from the well's mouth. Victoria and Harper remained by their wagon, Victoria's face gray, Harper's carefully neutral. Grace had come as well, though Sarah hadn't noticed her in the initial confusion. The girl stood apart from her mother, arms wrapped around herself, looking like she might shatter at any moment. For 30 minutes they waited. Sarah could hear Cole moving below the splash of water, the scrape of stone. The spring sun climbed higher, warming the air, but Sarah felt cold to her bones. Finally, Cole's voice echoed up from the depths. "I found something. Pull me up." The marshals hauled on the rope. Slowly, Cole emerged from the well, soaked from the waist down, covered in mud and debris. In his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it carefully on the ground and began to unwrap it. The crowd pressed closer, then gasped and drew back. Human remains. Bones still partially articulated, wrapped in rotted fabric. A skull with a crack at the base. Fragments of clothing identifiable as a woman's dress. And clutched in the skeletal fingers a silver locket. Cole opened the locket with gentle fingers. Inside was a photograph, a young woman with intelligent eyes. Catherine Wells. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Cole stood, water dripping from his clothes, and turned to Victoria. "Mrs. Thornton, this appears to be the remains of Catherine Wells. The medical examiner will need to confirm, but the evidence is clear. Can you explain how a federal agent's body ended up in a well on your family's former property?" Victoria didn't answer. She stood frozen, staring at the bones like she was seeing a ghost made flesh. Harper grabbed her arm. "Victoria, don't say anything, not one word." But something had broken in Victoria. 3 years of carrying this secret, of pretending, of lying to herself that it had been necessary. 3 years of seeing Catherine's face in every mirror, hearing her fall every time the wind rattled the windows. "It was an accident," she said, her voice barely audible. "Victoria, no." Harper's grip tightened, but Victoria pulled away from him, walked toward the well, toward Cole and the bones. "She fell. We struggled and she fell." The crowd erupted in whispers. Cole raised a hand for silence. "Mrs. Thornton, I need to advise you that anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney." "I know my rights, Agent Cole, and I'm telling you what happened." Victoria's voice grew stronger, clearer. "Catherine Wells came to my home under false pretenses. She was a federal agent pretending to be a mail-order bride. She infiltrated my family to destroy us." "She was doing her job," Cole said. "She was a liar and a spy." Victoria's composure shattered completely. "I found her telegram. I knew what she was. So yes, I confronted her, on the balcony of her room. I told her to leave, to forget what she'd learned and go back east. But she refused." Victoria's voice shook with remembered fury. She said she had a duty, said justice was more important than protecting criminals. I told her my husband was dead, that punishing him meant punishing innocent people who had nothing to do with his crimes. She didn't care. She said the law was the law. So you pushed her, Cole said quietly. I pushed her. The admission came out like a sob. I was angry, desperate. I pushed her not meaning to kill, just to make her stop talking, stop threatening my family. But she lost her balance, went over the railing, fell 3 stories onto the stone patio below. I heard her neck break. Sarah felt sick. She looked at James and saw her own horror reflected in his face. Victoria wasn't finished. I panicked, called William. He came, saw the body, and said we had to hide it, make it look like she'd run away. So we wrapped her in cloth, brought her here in the night, and put her down the well, covered it back up. Then we cleaned her room, packed her things, made it look like she'd left. She looked directly at Cole. That's what happened. An accident that we covered up because we were afraid. But I didn't murder her. I didn't mean to kill her. You pushed a federal agent off a balcony, let her die, and hid the body for 3 years, Cole said. That's murder, Mrs. Thornton, and it's going to be tried as such. He gestured to Morrison. Sheriff, arrest Mrs. Thornton for the murder of Catherine Wells. Morrison moved forward with handcuffs. Victoria didn't resist. She stood still as steel bracelets closed around her wrists, her dignity intact, even in defeat. Harper tried one more time. Victoria, stop talking. I can get you a lawyer who... It's too late for that, William. It's been too late for 3 years. She looked past him to where Grace stood, tears streaming down her face. Grace, honey, I'm sorry. I did this for you, to protect your future. I hope someday you can understand. Grace turned away, unable to look at her mother. As Morrison led Victoria toward his wagon, Cole called out, Mr. Harper, I'll need you to come in for questioning as well. You admitted to helping dispose of a body. That makes you an accessory to murder. Harper went pale but nodded stiffly. I'll come voluntarily, but I want it on record that I'm cooperating fully. Cole turned back to the well. There's more down there. The marshal saw it. Another bundle wrapped in oilcloth like the first. He descended again. This time he emerged carrying a leather portfolio carefully protected from water and decay. Catherine had hidden it well wrapped in layers of protection. Cole opened it carefully. Inside were more documents, the evidence Catherine had died for. James moved closer, Sarah beside him. Together they read over Cole's shoulder as he spread the papers on a makeshift table formed by a flat stone. The documents were damning. Contracts signed by Thomas Thornton, payments to enforcers, letters ordering specific acts of violence, and a list. 12 families terrorized. 3 confirmed murders, details that could never be explained away or justified. But there was more. Additional papers that made Sarah's blood run cold. One was a land transfer dated 1867. Henry Wade to Thomas Thornton, 160 acres, purchase price $200. Attached to it was a receipt, $500 paid to a man named Sykes for encouraging the Wade family to sell. The date matched when Sarah's father had fled Montana. Sarah's hands shook as she held the paper. Here was proof, documentation of the crime that had destroyed her family. Her father had told the truth. He hadn't sold willingly. He'd been driven out through violence. James read over her shoulder and went very still. Then he picked up another document, a land transfer dated 1878. The Mitchell family, signed by James Thornton as executor of the estate. More documents followed. 3 families forced out in the 5 years James had been managing the property. He'd signed the transfers. His name on every one. Sarah turned to look at him. You knew. I told myself they wanted to sell, James said, but his voice held no conviction. Richard brought me the papers, said it was standard business. I signed them because it was easier than asking questions. You signed them because you benefited, Sarah said, because every acre you took meant more money, more power. Yes. The admission came out hollow. I'm no better than my father. I just used lawyers instead of hired guns. Cole gathered all the documents carefully. This is everything Catherine came to find. Evidence of systematic land fraud and murder spanning 4 decades. This will bring prosecutions across the territory." He looked at James. "Mr. Thornton, these documents show your involvement in land fraud. That's a federal crime. I could arrest you right now." "Then do it," James said quietly. "I won't run from this." "James, no." Grace's voice cut through the tension. She ran to her brother, grabbing his arm. "You didn't know. You didn't kill anyone." "I knew enough. I should have asked questions, should have stopped it. Instead, I signed the papers and took the money." James gently removed Grace's hands. "I have to face this, Grace. It's the only way to make it right." Sarah watched him, feeling something twist in her chest. Anger, yes, because his family had destroyed hers, but also a reluctant respect. He was choosing accountability over comfort, justice over preservation. Cole seemed to be considering. "Mr. Thornton, I'm not going to arrest you today, but you will be required to testify in the upcoming trials, and there may be civil suits from the families your father and you defrauded. Are you prepared for that?" "I'll cooperate completely, whatever it takes to make this right." "Good." Cole turned to his marshals. "Secure all the evidence. Get the remains ready for transport to the federal examiner. We're going to build an airtight case." As the marshals worked, Sarah walked away from the well, needing space to process everything that had happened. She found herself at the edge of the old Henderson property, looking out at land that had once been someone's dream before Thomas Thornton destroyed it. James appeared beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "My father's name was in those documents." "I know. I saw. Your family paid to have him terrorized. They destroyed him, my mother, my brother, everything we had." "I know. And you benefited from it. You lived in luxury built on my family's suffering." "Yes." James didn't try to defend himself. "Sarah, I can't undo what was done. I can't bring your family back. But I can give everything up. The land, the money, all of it. I can make sure the families who were hurt get restitution." "That won't be enough." "I know that too." Sarah turned to face him. "Catherine Wells died trying to bring justice. My father died broken and poor. Your father and your family destroyed so many lives, and you just signed papers and pretended not to know. How do I forgive that?" "You don't," James said simply. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I deserve to lose everything and spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, and that's what I'm going to do. Even if it means prison. Even then." Sarah studied his face. She saw genuine remorse there, genuine determination to do better, but she also saw the man who'd lived comfortably on blood money for 32 years. "I'm leaving," she said. "Going back to Boston. I can't marry you, James. There's too much blood between us." "I understand." James's voice was quiet. "I'll pay for your ticket. Make sure you get home safely." "I don't want your money." "It's not mine. It never was. It belongs to the families my father stole from. You're one of those families. Take what you're owed." Before Sarah could respond, Cole approached. "Miss Wade, Mr. Thornton, I'll need formal statements from both of you. Written testimony of everything you saw and heard. Can you come to the federal office in Helena tomorrow?" "Yes," they said in unison. Cole nodded and walked away. Sarah and James were left standing in the ruins of the Henderson farm, surrounded by evidence of crimes committed before either of them were born, but that would shape the rest of their lives. "What will you do?" Sarah asked. "After all this?" James looked at the land spreading around them. "I'm going to give it back. All of it. Sell the estate, divide the money among the families who were hurt. Keep nothing for myself except enough to make sure Grace is provided for. That's not enough to erase what happened." "I know. But it's a start. And then I'll spend the rest of my life helping people like your father, people who were hurt by men like mine. I'll never make up for what was done, but I can try to stop it from happening again." Sarah wanted to hate him. It would be easier to hate him, to see him as simply another Thornton profiting from violence, but she couldn't quite manage it. He was complicit, yes, but he was also trying, however late, however imperfect, to do the right thing. "I'm still leaving," she said. "I know." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. Around them, federal marshals packed evidence. Victoria sat in a wagon headed for jail. The bones of Catherine Wells were being prepared for proper burial. Justice was being served. But it felt hollow. Catherine was still dead. Sarah's family was still destroyed. And all the trials and restitution in the world wouldn't bring back what had been lost. As they prepared to leave the Henderson farm, Sarah took one last look at the well. Catherine had hidden the truth there, knowing it might cost her life. She'd been brave, she'd been right, and she'd died for it. Sarah made a silent promise to the bones being carried away. Catherine's death would mean something. Sarah would make sure of it. She would testify. She would tell the truth, and she would never forget what happened when good people stayed silent in the face of evil. James helped her into the wagon for the ride back to town. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been uncovered. Justice would follow. But the cost had been devastating, and the wounds would take generations to heal, if they ever healed at all. The trial began on a cold October morning when the leaves had turned gold and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks. Helena's territorial courthouse was packed. Every seat filled, people standing 3 deep along the walls. This was the trial of the decade, perhaps of the century, though the century was still young and Montana not yet a state. Sarah sat in the witness section, a black shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had stayed, though, not for the reasons she'd originally intended. Not to marry James Thornton, not to build a life in Montana, but to see justice done, to make sure Catherine Wells's death meant something. Beside her sat Grace, now 17, her face pale beneath a dark bonnet. The girl had aged years in the months since her mother's arrest. She'd asked to attend the trial despite James's attempts to shield her. She needed to see it through, she'd said, needed to understand fully what her mother had done. James sat across the aisle in the defendant's witness section. He would testify, though not as the accused. Agent Cole had decided not to press federal charges against James for his role in the land fraud. The evidence showed he'd signed documents, yes, but proving he'd known they were fraudulent would be difficult. Instead, James had agreed to cooperate fully to provide restitution to the families harmed and to testify against those who'd orchestrated the schemes. Victoria Thornton sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers brought in from San Francisco. She'd lost weight in the month since her arrest. Her elegant clothes hung loose on her frame, but her back remained rigid, her chin high. Whatever awaited her, she would face it with the dignity she'd maintained her entire life. William Harper occupied a separate table with his own attorney. He'd made a deal: full testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would avoid a murder charge, but he'd spend years in prison for his role in covering up Catherine's death. Judge Whitmore entered, a stern-faced man appointed specifically for this case. The local judge had recused himself, citing his long relationship with the Thornton family. That alone told Sarah how deep the corruption ran in this territory. The clerk called the court to order. The territory of Montana versus Victoria Catherine Thornton. The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree in the death of federal agent Catherine Wells. The trial would last 3 weeks. Sarah watched as the machinery of justice ground slowly forward. Lawyers argued over procedure. Witnesses were called and dismissed. Evidence was presented with painstaking care. On the 4th day, Sarah took the stand. The prosecutor was a federal attorney named Reynolds, sent from Washington specifically for this case. He approached Sarah with careful respect. "Miss Wade, please tell the court how you came to be involved in this case." Sarah recounted her arrival in Montana, the advertisement, the warnings, finding Catherine's note, the excavation of the well. She spoke clearly, keeping her emotions in check, focused on facts rather than feelings. When she finished, the defense attorney rose for cross-examination. His name was Dalton, and he had a reputation for destroying witnesses on the stand. "Miss Wade," he began, his tone dripping with false courtesy, "you came to Montana Territory specifically to marry a wealthy man, did you not?" I came to marry a farmer. I was told he was poor. But you stayed when you learned he was rich. I stayed to find out what happened to Catherine Wells. How convenient. Dalton smiled coldly. A poor housemaid from Boston suddenly interested in justice. Tell me, Miss Wade, isn't it true that you hope to profit from this case, that Mr. Thornton has been supporting you financially for months? He's been supporting his cousin Grace, who is in my care, and he's providing restitution to my family for land his father stole. Restitution. Such a noble word for taking money from a man you claim to despise. Reynolds stood. Objection. Miss Wade's financial arrangements are irrelevant to whether Mrs. Thornton murdered a federal agent. Sustained, Judge Whitmore said sharply. Mr. Dalton, confine your questions to matters pertaining to this case, or I'll hold you in contempt. Dalton backed off, but Sarah could see it in some of the jurors' faces. Doubt, suspicion, the willingness to believe she was lying for money. But then other witnesses testified. Grace, her voice shaking, but her story unwavering, told of hearing her mother and Catherine arguing on the balcony of the scream of the terrible silence that followed. Ranch hands testified about seeing Victoria and Harper leave the estate in the middle of the night with something heavy wrapped in cloth. The medical examiner confirmed that Catherine's injuries were consistent with a fall from height, that her neck had been broken, that she'd been dead for approximately 3 years. And finally, William Harper took the stand. His testimony was devastating. He described in precise detail how Victoria had come to him the night Catherine died, panicked and desperate, how they'd wrapped the body and driven to the Henderson property, how they'd lowered Catherine into the well and covered it back up, how they'd cleaned the room, packed Catherine's belongings, created the fiction that she'd simply left. Did Mrs. Thornton tell you what had happened? The prosecutor asked. Yes. She said she'd confronted Catherine on the balcony, that they'd argued about Catherine's investigation, that Victoria had pushed her and Catherine had fallen. Did she express remorse? Harper was silent for a long moment. She said, I did what I had to do to protect my family. I won't apologize for that. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Whitmore gavelled for silence. Mr. Harper, the prosecutor continued, you're a lawyer. You knew disposing of a body was a crime. Why did you help? Because Victoria Thornton had been a client for 15 years, because I was paid well to protect the family's interests, and because I was a coward who chose money over morality. When Harper finished testifying, he walked past Victoria's table without looking at her. She watched him go, her face expressionless. On day 16 of the trial, Victoria herself took the stand. Her lawyers had advised against it, but Victoria insisted. She would tell her own story in her own words. She sat in the witness box, her hands folded in her lap, and began to speak. Catherine Wells came to my home under false pretenses. She pretended to be a mail-order bride. She smiled at my husband, acted as if she cared for him, all while planning to destroy everything we'd built. When I discovered she was a federal agent, I felt betrayed, violated. She'd invaded our home, our lives, our family. The prosecutor let her talk. Sometimes the best strategy was to let the defendant hang herself with her own words. I confronted her that night, Victoria continued. I told her to leave, to forget what she'd learned and go back east, but she refused. She said she had a duty to expose the truth, regardless of who it hurt. Victoria's voice grew stronger. I told her my husband was dead, that punishing him meant punishing innocent people who depended on the Thornton estate for their livelihoods. She didn't care. She said the law was the law, and everyone would have to live with the consequences. And what did you do then, Mrs. Thornton? The prosecutor asked quietly. I pushed her, not to kill her, just to make her stop talking, stop threatening everything I'd worked for. But she lost her balance, went over the railing. I heard her hit the stones below. I heard her neck break. The courtroom was silent. Even the rustling of papers had ceased. And after she fell, the prosecutor pressed, did you call for help? Did you summon a doctor? No. Did you contact the authorities? No. What did you do? I called William Harper. We hid the body. We made it look like she'd left voluntarily. We lied to her family, to the authorities, to everyone, for 3 years. Why, Mrs. Thornton? Victoria looked directly at the jury. Because I was protecting my daughter. Grace was 13 years old. If the truth came out, if I was arrested for murder, she would have lost everything. Her home, her future, her mother. I wasn't willing to let that happen. It was the wrong thing to say. Sarah could see it in the jurors' faces. They might have sympathized with a moment of panic, a terrible accident covered up in fear. But Victoria showed no remorse, only cold calculation. The prosecutor pressed harder. Mrs. Thornton, you say you pushed Catherine to make her stop talking, but you knew she was standing on a balcony 3 stories high. You knew a push could be fatal. I wasn't thinking clearly. You weren't thinking clearly for 3 years while you let Catherine's family suffer not knowing what happened to their daughter. Victoria had no answer to that. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree of federal agent Catherine Wells, we find the defendant Victoria Thornton guilty. Grace made a small sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Sarah put an arm around her shoulders. James sat motionless, staring at his hands. 2 days later, Judge Whitmore pronounced sentence. Victoria stood to receive it, her lawyers on either side. Mrs. Thornton, the judge said, his voice hard as granite. You murdered a federal agent who was engaged in the lawful performance of her duties. You obstructed justice for 3 years. You showed no remorse for your actions. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. You will be transferred to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, where you will remain for the rest of your natural life. May you find in that time some understanding of the gravity of what you have done. Victoria stood unmoved. Then she turned to Grace, and for the first time her composure cracked. Gracie, she said, her voice breaking, I'm sorry. I did it all for you. I hope someday you can understand. I love you. Grace couldn't respond. She turned her face into Sarah's shoulder and wept. Victoria was led away in chains. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a sound like thunder. 2 weeks after Victoria's sentencing, news arrived that Preston Drake had been captured at the Canadian border. He'd fled the moment he'd heard about the arrests, knowing his involvement in the telegraph operator's murder would come to light. Federal marshals had tracked him for days, finally cornering him at a remote crossing. There'd been a brief exchange of gunfire. Drake had been wounded in the shoulder and taken alive. His trial was swift. William Harper testified that Drake had ordered the killing of Daniel Hayes, the telegraph operator who'd known about Catherine's telegram to the federal authorities. A hired killer testified that Drake had paid him $500 to make the murder look like a robbery. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Drake guilty of murder for hire. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for March. Sarah did not attend. Neither did James. They'd seen enough death. Let the law take its course without spectators. In November, Agent Cole summoned James to the federal office in Helena. Sarah accompanied him, though she wasn't required to. Over the months since the trial, an uneasy alliance had formed between them. Not quite friendship, not romance, but a shared commitment to seeing justice done. Cole sat behind his desk, looking tired but satisfied. The Catherine Wells case had been his white whale for 3 years. Now it was resolved. Mr. Thornton, Cole began, the Department of Justice has reviewed your involvement in the land fraud cases. You signed 8 transfer documents between 1878 and 1880. 3 of those were clearly fraudulent. The other 5 exist in a legal gray area. James sat straight, ready to accept whatever came. I understand. I'm prepared to face charges. The department has decided not to prosecute you criminally. James blinked. What? You've cooperated fully with our investigation. You've agreed to provide complete restitution to the affected families. You've testified against your own family members. And frankly, proving that you knowingly participated in fraud would be difficult. Your lawyer could argue you were misled by Harper, that you signed documents in good faith. I wasn't in good faith, James said quietly. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know the answers. Perhaps, Cole said. But legally that's different from active fraud, so here's what will happen. You are banned from owning land in Montana Territory for 10 years. You will complete 500 hours of community service, and you will make a public sworn statement acknowledging your role in the land transfers and your failure to prevent them. James nodded slowly. I agree to all of that. There's one more thing. Cole pulled a letter from his desk. Catherine Wells had family in Philadelphia, her parents and younger sister. They've suffered for 3 years not knowing what happened to her. You owe them a personal apology. I'll go to Philadelphia. I'll speak to them directly. Cole studied James for a long moment. You're not what I expected, Mr. Thornton. Most men in your position would hire lawyers to fight. Every charge would protect their wealth at all costs. You're choosing accountability. That takes courage. It doesn't take courage to do what's right. It just takes finally being tired of doing what's wrong. In December, James traveled to Philadelphia. Sarah went with him. She told herself it was to ensure he followed through, but the truth was more complicated. Over the months, she'd watched James systematically dismantle the empire his father had built, sell the land, divide the money, live in a simple apartment working as a clerk. He was trying to be better, and she couldn't help but respect that. The Wells family lived in a modest brownstone in a working-class neighborhood. George Wells, Catherine's father, answered the door. He was 55 but looked older, grief having aged him prematurely. His wife Martha stood behind him, her eyes red from years of crying. Catherine's sister Elizabeth, 21, and heartbreakingly similar to Catherine in appearance, sat in the parlor. She studied James with the same intelligent gaze her sister had possessed. James stood in their small sitting room and told them everything. How Catherine had come to Montana, what she'd discovered, how she'd been killed, how her body had been hidden for 3 years. He held nothing back, accepted full responsibility for his family's crimes. When he finished, the room was silent. Finally, George Wells spoke. My daughter believed in justice, Mr. Thornton. She believed in the law. We wanted her to stay home where it was safe, but she said if good people didn't stand up to corruption, evil would never stop. His voice broke. So she went, and she died. And for 3 years we wondered if somehow it was our fault, if we should have stopped her, if loving her meant letting her go or forcing her to stay. It wasn't your fault, James said. It was mine, my family's. If I'd been braver, if I'd spoken up 3 years ago when I first suspected what had happened, you might have had answers sooner. I failed Catherine. I failed you. And I'm sorry. From the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry. Martha Wells was crying now. Can you bring her back? No, ma'am, I can't. Can you undo the years we spent not knowing, imagining the worst, hoping against hope she was alive somewhere? No. Then what good is your apology? The question hung in the air. James had no answer because there was no answer. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some damage was permanent. Elizabeth stood and crossed to James. Mother, stop. He didn't kill Catherine, and he's trying to make things right. That's more than most men would do. She looked at James. My sister died trying to change things, trying to stop powerful people from hurting the powerless. Will you continue that work? Yes, I swear it. I'll spend the rest of my life helping people like your sister, like the families my father destroyed. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then Catherine's death will mean something. That's all we can ask for. They didn't forgive him. James didn't expect them to, but they accepted his commitment, and that was enough. Sarah had waited outside during the meeting. When James emerged, his face was drawn but somehow lighter, as if confessing had lifted a weight he'd carried for years. How did it go? She asked. They didn't forgive me, but they believe I'll try to do better. Will you? Every day for the rest of my life. They walked back to their hotel through Philadelphia's cold streets. Snow was beginning to fall, the first real snow of winter. I'm going back to Boston, Sarah said suddenly. After we return to Montana, I'm taking the train east." James stopped walking. "Why?" "Because I've done what I came to do. Catherine has justice. Victoria is in prison. The families are getting restitution. There's nothing left for me in Montana." "There's Grace. She needs you." "Grace is strong. She'll be fine. And what about us?" Sarah looked at him. Over the months, something had shifted between them. Respect born of shared purpose. Understanding forged through crisis. Maybe even the beginning of something more. But was it enough? "There's no us, James. There can't be. Your family destroyed mine. Every time I look at you, I'll remember that." "I know, but I thought maybe over time you might be able to see me as separate from what my father did." "Are you separate from it? You lived on that money for 30 years. You signed those documents. You benefited from my family's suffering." "Yes, and I'm trying to make amends." "Trying isn't enough." They stood in the falling snow, two people connected by tragedy and separated by history. "If you want to go back to Boston, I won't stop you," James said finally. "But I'll ask you one thing. Don't go because you're running away. Go because it's what you truly want." Sarah thought about that as they walked back to the hotel. Was she running, or was she simply choosing to leave a place that held too much pain? The next morning, a telegram arrived for Sarah. It was from Martha Wells, Catherine's mother. "Miss Wade, my husband told me about your role in finding Catherine and bringing justice. Our daughter would want you to know this. She believed in redemption. She believed people could change. If Mr. Thornton is truly trying to change, don't let the past steal your future. Catherine wouldn't want that. Sincerely, Martha Wells." Sarah read the telegram 3 times. Then she made a decision. When they returned to Montana in January, she didn't immediately buy a ticket to Boston. Instead, she stayed. Not as James's intended bride, but as his partner in the work of restitution. They opened an office in Helena. Thornton and Wade Legal Aid. They helped farmers understand their rights, prevented new land grabs, provided free legal advice to those who couldn't afford lawyers. James worked mornings in the office and afternoons with his hands helping farmers repair barns, dig wells, build fences. Free labor, his way of repaying debts that could never fully be settled. Sarah managed the paperwork, researched precedents, organized community meetings. They were partners in purpose, if not in romance. Grace went to live with the Wells family in Philadelphia. She'd asked them, and they'd agreed. She wanted to study law like Catherine to fight for justice in her sister's memory. It was the best way she could honor her mother's crime by spending her life undoing the damage the Thornton family had caused. The months turned to years. The estate was sold in parcels to actual farmers. The money was divided among the families Thomas Thornton had victimized. Some accepted it gratefully. Others refused, saying no amount of money could erase what had been done. James accepted their refusal with dignity. By the spring of 1886, 2 years after the trial, Montana Territory had changed. New laws protected homesteaders. Land fraud carried serious penalties. The old guard, the powerful families who'd built empires through violence, found their influence waning. James and Sarah's office had become a fixture in Helena. People trusted them because they'd proven themselves, because James had given up everything to make things right, because Sarah had chosen justice over bitterness. One evening in May, they sat in the office working late on a particularly complicated case. Coffee had gone cold, the lamp burned low, outside spring rain drummed against the windows. "Do you ever regret staying?" James asked. Sarah looked up from the document she was reading. "Sometimes. Boston was home. I knew how to be there." "And Montana?" "Montana is where I'm needed. That's different from home. But maybe it's enough." James was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I know you said there could never be an us. I've respected that. But I need you to know something. These 2 years working beside you have been the best of my life. Not because of what we've accomplished, though, that matters, but because every day I get to watch you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. You make me want to be better than I am." Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest. "James, I'm not asking for anything," he continued. "I just want you to know. If someday, maybe years from now, you can look at me and see someone worth caring for instead of just the son of the man who hurt your family, I'll be here, waiting, trying every day to earn that." Sarah stood and crossed to the window. Rain streaked the glass, turning the street outside into a watercolor painting. She thought about her father, about the life he'd lost. She thought about Catherine dead at 26, trying to do the right thing. She thought about all the years she'd spent angry and poor and alone. Then she thought about the work they'd done, the families they'd helped, the changes they'd made, the good that had come from terrible evil. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "I may never be ready to forgive your family for what they did to mine, but I'm ready to stop letting the past control my future." She turned to face him. "So I'm staying, not as your wife, not yet, maybe not ever, but as your partner, in this work, in building something good from the ashes of something terrible." James smiled, and it transformed his face. "That's enough. That's more than enough." They shook hands across the desk, sealing a partnership that was more binding than marriage. A commitment to justice, to healing, to making sure that the cycle of violence that had defined Montana's past wouldn't define its future. The years continued to pass. In 1888, James and Sarah married in a small ceremony attended by Grace Agent Cole and a few close friends. It wasn't a romantic affair. It was a practical recognition of a partnership that had already proven itself. They had 2 children, Henry named for Sarah's father and Catherine named for the woman whose death had brought them together. The children grew up knowing the truth about their family's history, the good and the terrible, the crimes and the redemption. Grace became a lawyer in Philadelphia working for women's rights and social justice. She changed her last name to Wells Thornton, honoring both the woman who'd died for justice and the family she'd been born into. Victoria remained in prison at Deer Lodge. She wrote to Grace occasionally. Grace wrote back, though the letters were brief and formal. Some wounds healed, others scarred over but never fully closed. 10 years after the trial, in the summer of 1894, James stood in his small garden behind the house he and Sarah had bought on the outskirts of Helena. It wasn't a mansion, just a simple home with 3 bedrooms and a kitchen where Sarah taught their children to read. He was 42 now, gray threading through his hair, lines deepening around his eyes. His hands were as calloused as any farmer's scarred from a decade of manual labor. An official-looking envelope had arrived that morning. Sarah had opened it at breakfast, read it, and handed it to James without a word. Presidential pardon, his criminal record cleared, permission to own land again, and a commendation for service to justice and exemplary rehabilitation. James had read it 3 times, hardly believing it was real. Now he stood in his garden holding the letter, trying to process what it meant. Forgiveness from the government. Official recognition that he'd changed. But did it matter? He knew the truth. He'd been complicit in his father's crimes. He'd lived on tainted wealth. He'd signed documents that destroyed families. A piece of paper from Washington couldn't change that. Sarah appeared in the doorway, 5-year-old Henry on her hip, 3-year-old Catherine holding her hand. "Papa." Catherine ran to him, arms outstretched. James scooped her up, this little girl who carried the name of a woman she'd never meet, a woman who'd died trying to do what was right. "Your papa got an important letter today," Sarah said, approaching with Henry. "What's it say?" Henry asked with the fierce curiosity of a 5-year-old. "It says sometimes people make mistakes, but if they work very hard to fix them, they can be forgiven." "Did you make mistakes, Papa?" "Yes, son, very serious ones." "But you fixed them." James looked at Sarah. She nodded, slightly encouragement in her eyes. "I tried. I'm still trying. Every day." "That's good," Henry said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Trying is important." Out of the mouths of children, James thought. He'd spent 10 years trying to atone, and his 5-year-old son had just summed up the entire philosophy in 4 words. That evening, after the children were in bed, James and Sarah sat on their small porch watching the sun set over the Montana mountains. The same mountains that had watched Thomas Thornton build an empire of blood. The same mountains that had watched Victoria push Catherine to her death. The same mountains that would watch long after they were all dust. "Do you think we've done enough?" James asked. "There's no such thing as enough," Sarah replied. "Your father and grandfather hurt too many people. We can't undo that. We can only try to stop it from happening again." "But have we made a difference?" Sarah thought about the office they ran, the families they'd helped, the laws that had changed, the culture that was slowly, painfully shifting toward justice instead of power. "Yes," she said finally, "we've made a difference. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to change the future." James took her hand. After 6 years of marriage, the gesture still felt precious. Sarah had given him something he didn't deserve. Not forgiveness exactly, but partnership, respect, and slowly, carefully, something that might be called love. "I'm proud of who you've become," Sarah said. "Not the man you were, the man you chose to be." That night James dreamed of Catherine Wells, not the broken body in the well, but Catherine as she'd been alive, vibrant, intelligent, determined. In the dream she stood on the balcony of the Thornton estate looking out over land that had been stolen and was now being returned. She turned to James and smiled. "You finished it," she said. "What I started. Thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to help you when you were alive. But you were brave enough to help after I was dead. That's something. That's worth something." James woke with tears on his face. Sarah stirred beside him. "Bad dream," she murmured. "No, a good one, I think." As dawn broke over Montana, James rose and dressed quietly. He had work to do. A farmer north of Helena was being pressured to sell his land. James would help him understand his rights, help him stand against men who took what they wanted regardless of the law. It was small work, undramatic, nothing that would make the newspapers or be remembered by history. But it was honest work, good work, the kind of work that slowly, stone by stone, built a better foundation than the one his father had laid. Sarah found him in the kitchen making coffee. "Early start?" she asked. "The Morrison farm. They need help." "I'll come with you. Grace is visiting next week. She'll want to hear about the work we're doing." They prepared for the day together, partners in the truest sense. Outside, Montana stretched vast and beautiful and full of possibility. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still being written. And for the first time in his life, James Thornton was writing it with clean hands and an honest heart. 15 years later, in 1909, James Thornton would die at age 57, his body worn out from years of physical labor. He would die in the simple house he shared with Sarah, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, at peace with himself for the first time since childhood. At his funeral, dozens of farmers would attend, men and women he'd helped over the years. They would speak of his generosity, his dedication to justice, his willingness to do the hard work of making things right. Grace Wells Thornton, by then a prominent lawyer in Philadelphia, would deliver the eulogy. She would speak honestly about her stepfather's complicity in her grandfather's crimes, but she would also speak about his redemption, about the choice he'd made to be better than his inheritance. Sarah would bury him next to the plot she'd reserved for herself, not in the Thornton family cemetery with his father and grandfather, but in the public cemetery in Helena among the ordinary people he'd spent his last decade serving. His tombstone would read simply, James Thornton, 1852 to 1909. He tried to make things right. Victoria Thornton would outlive her stepson by 3 years, dying in prison at 73. She would be buried in a potter's field, her grave unmarked. Grace would not attend the funeral. Catherine Wells' grave, by contrast, would become a site of remembrance. Federal agents would leave flowers on the anniversary of her death. Reformers would invoke her name when fighting for justice. She would be remembered not as a victim, but as a hero who died in service to her principles. But that was all still to come. On this spring morning in 1894, James Thornton was 42 years old with half his life still ahead of him. He climbed into the wagon beside Sarah, and together they drove north toward the Morrison farm. The sun rose higher, warming the land. Somewhere a meadowlark sang its liquid song. The mountains stood eternal and unmoved witnesses to everything that had been and everything that would be. James had been born into blood and violence. He'd lived the first 30 years of his life profiting from suffering, but he'd chosen a different path. And though the walking was hard and the destination uncertain, he walked it anyway. Because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Face the truth of what they'd done. Make amends where possible. Build something better from the ruins of something terrible. And try. Every single day, just try. The wagon rolled on through the Montana morning, carrying two people who'd found purpose in ashes and hope in accountability. Behind them lay a history of crime and suffering. Before them lay the hard, honest work of redemption. It wasn't the life James had been born to, but it was the life he'd chosen, and that made all the difference.